Today, this is what MARTA, or the Metro Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority system, looks like. A cross of north-south rapid rail lines and a weaving bus network that attempts to provide transportation to the sprawling metropolitan region at $2.50 a ride. Most agree the system is far from ideal, sparking such headlines as, "Where it all went wrong? Is Atlanta's MARTA really that bad?" And even the existence of the website domain name martasucks.com. Common complaints are that MARTA has inconvenient train station locations, it lacks reliable, timely service, and it is hard to access information about it, ranging from simply finding an existing route schedule to information about delays in services. Despite its weakness, MARTA serves 400,000 riders per day, making it the 8th largest transit system in the entire country, according to the Georgia Encyclopedia. What's clear is there are a lot of people who need and want to use public transportation and are willing to, or have no choice but to, make do with the limited infrastructure that exists. But a better system, something on par with other American cities such as Washington, D.C., New York, or Chicago, has certainly filled the daydreams of many an urban Atlanta nerd, and perhaps other less nerdy riders who find themselves spending inordinate amounts of time on their way from point A to B. But was Atlanta's public transportation always so lacking? I'd argue no. In the first half of the 20th century, the city actually had a robust system of trolley or streetcar lines that offered transportation throughout the city. Indeed, from 1871 to 1949, a private industry in the city developed an impressive streetcar system that could take residents all around town. Here, I'll dig into that history and offer some light analysis. Atlanta was a city founded on railroad transportation. Goods were shipped through the center of its downtown, connecting the southeast to the rest of the nation. At first, the city remained relatively small, based around this central node of train activity. But as wealth accrued in the hands of key train-related capitalists, this new elite wished to live away from the central city with its density and crime. The first streetcars were developed to this end. In 1871, George Adair and Richard Peter with the Atlanta Streetcar Company established the first horse-drawn streetcar going to the West End. In the following years, the company laid track to other elite neighborhoods such as Inman Park and Druid Hills, which were even called streetcar suburbs. By the end of the 1880s, the company owned 15 miles of track, 50 streetcars, and 200 horses and mules for their operation. The fundamentally wealthy character of early streetcars was perhaps best captured in the popular 9-mile circle route of the late 1800s that looped through beautiful new elite neighborhoods such as Ansley Park and Virginia Highlands, and was a popular weekend pleasure trip for those of means. Nevertheless, soon streetcar companies saw the money-making potential in running lines from working-class neighborhoods to factories and other workplaces, and expanded their routes accordingly. Though Adair and Peters Atlanta Streetcar was the largest company in the city, streetcar transport companies could legally be developed by anyone who received a charter from the Georgia General Assembly. The city of Atlanta required that when opening a new route, streetcar companies pay for 40% of paving costs, as most roads before the arrival of the new service were unpaved, and the city would cover the rest. The city also maintained some degree of oversight and regulation, particularly on the matter of fares, but for the most part, the companies were free to run their businesses as they pleased. An odd thought for those of us living today, where most public transportation systems are publicly owned. By 1891, 5 separate streetcar companies were operating in the city. That year, Joel Hurt purchased them all and consolidated them into the Atlanta Consolidated Street Railway. Hurt, who had previously opened the city's first electric streetcar in 1889, made it his priority to electrify all routes in the new consolidated company. This was fine by the emerging electricity industry, which in Atlanta was controlled largely by Henry Atkinson. While the Georgia Electric Light Company had plenty of demand for their product in the nighttime, when the city and private customers would buy electricity for street lights and home lighting, there was less demand for their product during the day. As the upfront capital investment in developing electrical plants was extremely high, Atkinson and other electricity providers had a vested interest in finding new markets for their product during the day. Streetcars, running during working hours, provided the perfect solution. At first, Hurt's streetcars and Atkinson's electricity worked largely in business harmony, but Hurt, as an aspiring monopolist, decided he wanted to open his own electricity company to fuel his lines. This began a protracted and highly public conflict between the two capitalists, so spicy as to be called by the newspapers the Second Battle of Atlanta, and ultimately resulted in the consolidation of their two small empires into the Georgia Railway and Electric Company in 1902. This company would be the dominant provider of streetcar lines for the remainder of their existence in Atlanta. And even after they were phased out, it would eventually become Georgia Power, the company that to this day has a virtual monopoly on electricity in the state. The Georgia Railway and Electric Company developed the system to its full glory. This is a map of the trolley lines near the year of peak ridership, which was 1926, giving 96 million rides. It even included some interurban lines running to Stone Mountain, Marietta, and other suburbs for long-distance commuters. But by this time, the system's demise had already been on the horizon for a while. The first personal automobile arrived in Atlanta in 1901, and shortly thereafter, car dealerships began to pop up all over the place. By the 1920s, car traffic was already beginning to become a problem downtown and affecting streetcar service. Cars not only inconvenienced trolleys by increasing traffic on the roads, but as early as 1950, informal privately owned bus services called jitneys began directly competing with streetcars. Cleverly, without much in the way of regulation, they would run on existing routes, offering lower rates and much faster travel. But more than anything, it was the private automobile that caused the demise of the streetcar. People who could afford it, and ironically, particularly those suburban elites who had been the impetus for constructing streetcars in the first place, opted to buy their own private automobiles. By 1924, traffic had become such a problem in Atlanta that the city commissioned a New York firm to investigate its developing transportation nightmare. The Beeler Report, as it came to be called, recommended a complete overhaul of the city's transportation infrastructure, making exclusive and separate right-of-ways for automobiles, streetcars, and pedestrians. As a funny aside here, they suggested that pedestrians should have subterranean people movers with separate tracks moving at 2, 4, and 6 miles per hour, depending on how quickly you wanted to go and how much of a rush you were. The report also strongly recommended eliminating the jitneys and integrating formal gasoline-powered bus services with the existing streetcar network. Atlanta and the Georgia Railway and Electric Company took up many of the Beeler Report suggestions, though sadly not the underground people movers, briefly improving the overall transportation system. But the problems created by the automobile continued, and the city and region did little to help the matter. They generally refused to participate in long-term urban planning, and increasingly shifted their priorities to support car-centric transportation, particularly with the construction of the interstates beginning in the 1940s. Indeed, Atlanta officials saw gasoline-powered transportation as the way of the future, and in 1943, the city council stated their intention to eliminate electric trolleys completely and replace them with motor buses for the purpose of modernizing the city. Meanwhile, by 1937, the Georgia Railway and Electric Company had already begun replacing their conventional track-based streetcars with trackless trolleys. Essentially, electric buses, these trolleys used the existing electric streetcar grid as a power source, but were larger and faster than their predecessors and, importantly, air-conditioned. Monumentally, in 1949, the last track-based trolley left the road. And interestingly enough, many of these discontinued streetcars from Atlanta were sold to South Korea, where they were put to use in Seoul's public transportation system. The trackless trolleys lived a relatively short life themselves, in 1963 replaced entirely by the diesel bus. Shortly thereafter, the entire transportation system was taken over by MARTA and began its slow transition into what we have today. It is worth taking a moment to talk in more depth about the relationship between Atlanta streetcars and race. In 1891, the Georgia General Assembly passed segregation legislation that explicitly impacted streetcars and mandated its enforcement by trolley conductors. But the practical enforcement of this law remained somewhat in flux. The general policy required that black riders sit or stand at the rear of the vehicle and exit through the rear trolley doors. From the beginning, black riders resented this second-class treatment and organized boycotts and protests as early as 1892, the year after the segregation law went into effect. For their part, racist white Atlantans were resentful that they had to share public space with blacks, some demanding that there be separate cars for the two groups, or at the very least that black riders be relegated to a trailer dragged behind the main car. Other whites, particularly those in elite suburban neighborhoods, protested the fact that streetcars led black people through their neighborhoods. For both of these reasons, whites organized various boycotts of their own. For the streetcar operators, business came before all. They knew that A, they relied on black ridership to stay solvent, and B, they could not afford to run separate services along racial lines. And so they engaged in a careful game of trying to keep all parties content enough to continue using their services. But in the hyper-racist two-class society of the post-war South, black riders invariably bore the brunt of racial conflict. Historian Casey Cater argues that as one of the few places where whites and blacks came into contact outside of the realm of service, the social space of streetcars worked to bolster the anti-black sentiments that led to the violent explosion of the 1906 race riots in Atlanta. During the riot itself, white rioters pulled black riders from the streetcars on Peachtree Street and beat them, killing at least 3. And the horrors of September of 1906 were not the only time black riders were subject to violence or mistreatment on the trolleys. As historian Kevin Cruz writes, under Georgia's segregation legislation, conductors of private transit companies had almost unlimited police powers. They could order paying customers to move anywhere they chose, eject them from the trolley, and, if they deemed it necessary, resort to physical violence. In fact, in the 1940s, conductors were legally deputized and armed with revolvers, resulting in the killing of quite a number of unarmed black passengers, in scenes echoed today in police shootings of unarmed black men. Violence aside, just as with MARTA today, the streetcar seriously underserved black parts of town as compared to white neighborhoods. As new black middle-class suburbs began to spring up toward the end of the streetcar system's life in the 1940s, black residents were largely unable to solicit streetcar routes to their neighborhoods. Ultimately, it would not be until well after the dissolution of the streetcar system in 1957 that public transportation in Atlanta would be desegregated. But by this time, and in large part in response to desegregation, white-moneyed interest in public transportation would be very much diminished. What's clear is that there was a time when Atlanta had a truly robust transportation infrastructure. One could get all over town and even into the far suburbs reliably and affordably, with no real traffic to speak of. But I am by no means making a starry-eyed let's go back to the past argument. This system was seriously flawed. It was privately owned, and it was embedded in a deeply racist South that, in its best moments, dehumanized black riders and, in its worst, resulted in their deaths. What's more, its heyday as an effective transportation option was a very brief period, 30 years, or maybe 40 if you're being generous. Just as soon as the city had enough streetcar infrastructure to really move people around, the private automobile and its unequivocal endorsement by all branches of planning and governance started to edge the industry out. Indeed, even if the political will and funding were there to bring streetcars back today, they would be effectively useless for the same reasons they petered out in the middle of the 20th century. Cars. But we don't have to merely speculate about the impracticality of reviving streetcars in the city today, as it has been tried. The Atlanta streetcar, completed in 2014, has been an abysmal failure. 10 years of planning, $90 million of public funding, has all resulted in a sad 2.7-mile loop of track in the city's rather empty central business district. The trolley sits in traffic, largely functioning to move tourists from one museum to another at a speed only marginally faster than walking. Not to mention, ridership has been extremely low. Now, having completed this research on the trolley system of Atlanta's past and its 100 miles of track, the recent Atlanta streetcar project seems even more of a perverse joke to me than it did before. It seems to me that where the rich set their collective desire is where policy and infrastructure often follow. This is as true of transportation as anything else. Today, as the city gentrifies, a new class of urban elites want better public transportation. Never mind that it was the parents and grandparents and great-grandparents of these very people that fled the urban landscape, whether it was Atlanta or somewhere else, demanding the highway and the automobile, taking advantage of federally subsidized home mortgages that helped build the generational wealth they continue to benefit from. Now they are back. It's so silly, they say, shaking their heads, that MARTA is such a mess, that we have to drive everywhere. We want good inner-city transportation. And if you ask me, they'll get it. Already, we have the 22-mile loop of the Atlanta Beltline walking path well underway. And in 2019, MARTA approved a $1.3 billion expansion that will include about 30 miles of light rail, some of which on the Beltline itself, 22 miles of commuter rail, and 14 miles of designated bus rapid transit. Atlanta's most often cited mantra is, quote, "a city too busy to hate," coined by Mayor Bill Hartsfield in the 1960s about the city's supposed racial progressiveness. My thoughts on this are that A, it was and is patently untrue. The city has racism baked into its DNA. Today, still, it is the most income unequal city in the entire country, and these economic discrepancies fall almost exactly along racial lines. And B, our mantra should really be, out with the old and in with the new. We as a city have always been quick to throw away what we have, be it ideas, buildings, infrastructure, or human beings, to make room for whatever claims to be the newest and shiniest. Freeways, stadiums, parks, trains, Olympic Games, hotels, convention centers, and the list goes on. This dim-witted practice has not only led to a great diversity of undesirable outcomes, but it has made it much harder for us than a lot of American cities to remember our own history. It is hard to remember what is no longer there. Here and there, throughout the city, one can still see old trolley tracks poking through the asphalt, such as here, in my own neighborhood, at the intersection of Clifton and McClendon. Let them remind us not of some former glory of public transportation. Let them remind us of our historically reoccurring ineptitude. If the social revolution does not come, if an environmental catastrophe does not render all points of policy debate moot, if, in short, the rich and highly educated continue to rule and make the big decisions that affect us all, may they be somewhat better than their forebears. May Atlanta remember a thing or two from its past.